you're looking at Irish beef coming in, or agriculture coming in from the rest of Europe, faced with common external tariff application and consequent food price inflation, the UK government will be faced with a choice. Either we maintain the current situation, or we apply a zero rate on an MFN basis for a lot of these products. We will clearly do that. And if we were to do that, that would expose, in the case of Irish beef, the Irish beef industry to global competition from industrial strength beef producers, which would decimate the Irish beef industry, which is a reason why no deal is unlikely to be canvassed for by Europe and Ireland. So I think it's quite unlikely that we will get to that point. But clearly, the possibility of having no free trade agreement is implicit in any negotiation. And you must be prepared in any negotiation to be able to cope with, as best you can, that situation. And I think the government ought to be accelerating its efforts to do that. And a lot of it requires things that we would do unilaterally, and those things can and will be done. But all of this will make it more likely, not less likely, more likely that we will get to a comprehensive free trade agreement. I mean, it would take monumental incompetence, and I hate to say that, in the current situation, but and given how we've negotiated thus far, but it would take monumental incompetence if you consider that the European initial opening bid is a comprehensive free trade agreement with regulatory cooperations, customs facilitations, and Irish border facilitations. It would be monstrous incompetence to be unable to get, for the UK, to get to a deal of some kind as a result of that.
Let me turn it over to our crowd to see who's got a question we have.
Yeah, sure. We'll have a mic runner come around. We ask people to follow the WIDO rules of identify yourself, who you represent, and to please ask your question in the form of a question.
Yes, no statements.
Thank you, Guy Herb, former U.S. trade official. Two questions. Could you elaborate on Canada plus? And also, have you given any consideration to incorporating the other NAFTA members or USMCA members into your negotiation? Why limit your bilateral scope to the United States when you're losing free trade area with Canada and with Mexico? You have a much larger field to play on if you play the NAFTA card.
I'll do Canada plus. Sure. At the beginning of this process, one of the keys in this process has been the European Union's determination not to allow the same level of access to the single market as you would as a member. So one of the strategic decisions was to try to use existing European precedents, existing European free trade deals, as a precedent. So we can turn around and say, this is not special, this is not cherry picking, this is something which is specific that you've done before. And so Canada itself is a generally good free trade deal, zero tariffs in most cases, either immediately or as an aspiration over time. But what it doesn't have, for example, is very much the way mutual recognition arrangements. Mutual recognition arrangements, probably the best example there is the South Korea arrangement with the European Union for motor trade, because it's under the UNECE rules, and that means that South Korean vehicles sent to be sold in the EU do not have to be re-inspected. On the phytosanitary front, the New Zealand veterinary arrangement allows lower sampling and more intelligence-led sampling for inspection purposes of animal products being sent, animal and botanical products being sent to the UK and sent to the EU. So it's basically built around all the best practice from all of the various free trade agreements. So that given that we have to do this under time pressure, if we do this, we go back under time pressure within a month or so, we say, here we are, this is something which is all based on entirely EU precedent, entirely tested before, so there's no new risk to you, and we want you to sign that off pretty quickly. That's the way it's thought out.
Yeah, we at the IEA put together this Plan A+, which is a plan for what we think would make sense for the UK in terms of independent trade policy. In fact, one of the things that we have suggested is, you have a full-pillared, basically, trade policy approach. What you do unilaterally, improving tariffs where you can, where you don't have competitive or directly competitive products, substitutable products. Improve your own regulatory system, bilaterally, US deal, but it's not just the US deal, as you said, it's, we can do a deal with India that it doesn't really, I don't think anyone else can do. I mean, we have very offensive interests with India in terms of legal services, financial services, Scotch whisky, tax and tariff, for example. And we have very limited defensive interests. As long as we can be open on agriculture and we can have flexibility on SPS, which is crucial for every deal we would do, and by the way, it's taken off the table by this withdrawal agreement. As long as we can do that, then that's a possibility for India. We have advocated it's not mutually exclusive to have a US deal and also to have a NAFTA accession kind of, or USMCA, whatever we want to call it, accession model for the UK as well. In fact, the interesting is, while the negotiations, USMCA negotiations were going forward, both the Trade Minister of Mexico and the Canadian government suggested that they would want to have the UK as part of this process. So I think that is possible. But the other plurilateral, big plurilateral arrangement is the TPP, or the CPTPP. And I think the Japanese have done a fantastic job to keep it alive. They very much want us in it. The Australians want us to be the first accession country. And let's not beat about the bush. It is clearly, from their perspective, in the hope that at some point the US will re-engage with the CPTPP. And I think that's, again, part of our UK-US relationship that would be beneficial. But I think we want an advanced trade agreement with the UK, with the EU, and we've got a great starting point. We couldn't have asked for a better starting point from the European side. We really couldn't have crafted it any better. And it's up to us to see if we can put, as David said, text on the table and give them something to react to.
Let's get a press question.
I can just make one very brief comment, tying in with the preceding question. All the gloom about no deal assumes we are stupid enough to go to the maximum level of tariff under WTO. We don't have to. We could set much lower levels of tariff as long as they apply worldwide, and I'd be very much strongly in favour of that.
Hey, this is Kurt Mills from the National Interest magazine. You mentioned that you guys don't plan to sit on your hands, and that the number one problem with the current deal before Parliament is that it could preclude a US-UK free trade agreement. Are you pursuing that while you're here in Washington? Are you meeting members of the administration? Thank you.
I think when we planned this trip initially, we did not anticipate that the events of yesterday and the day before would have been.
Oh, no. Claim credit. Don't.
Contrary to those choreography.
I would admit my comment at the beginning was a joke.
No, I mean, we're clearly here to advocate for a UK-US free trade agreement. I mean, we're meeting with members of the administration, we're meeting with industry groups, we're meeting with lots of people. We're meeting with some representatives of states because we believe that a UK-US free trade agreement is massively in the interest of not only the UK, but more importantly, I think, since we are here in Washington, it is massively in the US interest to have a major economy that has a more pro-competitive, outcome, effects-based approach to regulation than the EU. I think there is Brexit is a very big event, and Brexit is, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of a declining global trading system, where there is a crisis in the trading system, no concluded round for 23 years, a third of the lifetime of the gap. Services liberalisation cupboard is completely empty, the built-in agenda. No meaningful liberalisation in that area for 20 plus years. And the economic indicators are bearing this out. Global trade as a percentage of global GDP was down growth of global trade stalled in 2015. Unheard of things are happening. And this is causing economists like Christine Lagarde to say, we're in the new normal. We're going to have 2% developed country growth, and we just be happy with that. That's absolutely absurd. We don't have to. There are so many barriers. There are so many global regulatory protections that exist now. It's incumbent on those countries that believe in competition, as David said in his speech, at the beginning of his speech, those countries that believe in competition on the merits as an organising economic principle need to come together in order to promote this vision around the world. If we don't do it, we are going to lose. There are too many forces pushing for anti-competitive prescriptive regulation. As Avedo said, not only are we going in the wrong direction, we are accelerating. I mean, I think we are at a really serious crisis point in the global trading system and the international sort of economic order. And there is an opportunity to have a major G7 nation adopt a different approach. We should seize it.
Yes, I mean, unashamedly we are here. Shankar and I were here in September, where a draft treaty was actually launched by think tanks from both Washington and Westminster. So that was a legal text drafted up. We had support from senior senators and others. But emphatically, Shankar's right. This is a real moment for the United States. We could get sucked back into the regulatory regime where we can not play any positive role, or we could be freed up and we get on those world bodies, and everyone bangs on WTO, but don't forget the area I was involved in. There's Codex Alimentarius on food, there's IPPC on forestry farm products, OIE on animal health, where we would be really pushing for modern technologies. Do not underestimate the insane hostility of the European Union to technology and the damage it's doing to the European Union. Fact, which you can all understand, trot out very rapidly, is if France had the same productivity and used the same technology as the United States in maize, what you call corn, France would produce 6.1 million tonnes more every year. Or, if you like forest, you like walking around, or you want to build something, France would free up 500,000 hectares every year for other activities. So that's the extent to which this crazy hostility to technology is forcing the European Union further and further behind the rest of the world. And we don't want to be part of that.
Good morning. Here in WITA, we have two rules. The first rule is you introduce yourself, give your name and your affiliation. So happy to do that, Dale Cramond, Embassy of Ireland. The second rule is that you ask a question and not make a comment. I'm going to break that rule if that's okay, Ken. And I'm just going to make a couple of comments.
We would expect nothing less.
The trick is you make the comment and then the last thing you say is question.
Look, the first issue would say, look, clearly I don't agree with everything that the panel has said this morning. It's not going to surprise you to hear that. Look, the issue in Northern Ireland and the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, there's nothing in this draft agreement that has any threat on the constitutional status of the Northern Ireland or the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement. It's absolutely enshrined that until the majority of people in Northern Ireland vote to reunite with Ireland, Northern Ireland remains a partner of the United Kingdom. We already have certain controls for animal health on an all-island basis. Nothing changes here. It's just formalising some of the rules. We already have these checks. There's nothing changes there, Mr. Patterson. The second issue I would make just on look clear. Everyone wants. The situation with a no deal, it would be terrible for Ireland and the Irish beef sector. No one denies that. So I can absolutely 100% agree with you. But I would also say potentially for your own sheep sector, 95% of your sheep exports go to the European Union. What do you think would happen in a no deal there? Okay, that's an issue. What in this agreement stops you having a close trading relationship with the European Union? Ireland and every other member state now are right behind the UK to ensure now they get as close trading relationship as possible so that the backstop issue in the border in Northern Ireland never becomes a reality. Thank you.
Right, as Owen was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I'll let him answer this one.
Yes, I'd also point out I did a lot of business in Ireland, North and South, and I was the Shadow Secretary of State for 3 years, going every week, spent a lot of time actually on the border. Sadly, I couldn't visit now for obvious reasons. I totally disagree with you. And more importantly, David Trimble, Nobel Prize winner, co-author of the agreement, totally disagrees with you. What we are seeing here with this appalling proposal is a different regime for Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland citizens will have to obey different rules. And that is wrong. That is a clear breach of the agreement. And as David said very clearly only last week in a policy exchange paper with Graham Gudgeon, which you can all look on the internet in 10 minutes' time, that is a clear breach because it does not engage the Assembly. Now we know the Assembly is not sitting, but the Assembly members could be called together. So I'm afraid you are simply wrong on that. This is a very flagrant breach of the Belfast Agreement. I think one other area which you have touched on, which would be even more destabilising, would be if there was no deal and we were stupid enough to put up high tariffs, because that would absolutely hammer the Southern Irish beef industry and dairy industry. That would be really bad. That I think personally is a bigger threat to stability in Northern Ireland than anything else. And here I don't agree with you. I don't see why we're going to be so stupid as to put up tariffs. Why are we going to do that? What we want to do is to keep costs down. Our least well-off citizens, according to economists of free trade, would be 15% better off if they had access to cheaper food and cheaper clothing around the world, because obviously that's a high proportion of their incomes. On the issue of phytosanitary regime, there is a regime for live animals, which I discussed with Michel Barnier when I took a delegation over with David Trimble only, about 3 weeks ago. But that is just for live animals, and that's a very sensible thing to have. I went to Larne in person 2 weeks ago and looked at it. This only applies to inspection of live animals. It does not apply to the general phytosanitary regime. We would like to have a superior regime in Northern Ireland. And to your chagrin, I can tell you there are some banned products which are more prevalent in the Republic of Ireland than they are in Northern Ireland, because you've got less effective detective systems. So we raised this with Barney. We see after a proper Brexit, where we can run our own regulatory regime, to have a superior regime of regulation. You can't have any of that under these proposals. And just to repeat what I said about the border, there is a border now. VAT, tax, excise duty, security border. It works perfectly well with existing technologies. There's a very high level of compliance on VAT, despite many people in the border areas not being loyal to the British state, who would like to very much live in the United Ireland. But they're not going to be stupid about their VAT, and they claim it back. So all we are saying, we've worked this out with people with long experience in the customs industry, people who've been in the working customs for all their careers, working with the European group of customs brokers, which is 19,000 organisations to do freight forwarding and customs broking, representing 80% of Europe's customs transactions. They have helped us and endorsed our proposals. And what we're talking about are existing systems, the REC system for rules of origin, the TRACES system for phytosanitary tracking. All these happen now. Nothing new, nothing revolutionary at all, just existing systems which work. And I went to Rotterdam only last week for 2 days, and I saw these systems working. And on the most contentious products, talking about the phytosanitary stuff, 30,000 containers come into Rotterdam every year from all around the world. They would be children frozen meat and fish products. Of those, 100% are, quote, inspected. That means they go under a transit document 40 kilometres to the border inspection post. So you translate to Ireland's geography, 40 kilometres takes you from Newry into the Belfast suburbs. They then go through a paper inspection. This is, David touched on it. This is all intelligence-led. If it's a container from a well-established New Zealand abattoir with a long record of compliance, with good veterinary scheduling, that will go through very rapidly. In minutes, they'll check the paperwork. Of those that are stopped, 2 to 3% perhaps are inspected more closely. Of those 2 to 3%, only 10% are actually physically opened up and possibly samples taken. And these are products from all over the world. And we're talking about products within the European Union, across the border in Ireland, where we know exactly who is who, we know exactly who the scally vets are, we know exactly which supplier might be dodgy. Most of this trade is run by enormously large professional organisations, and there is not going to be a biosanitary or phytosanitary problem.
I hope you get from that in all of these areas we've done a huge amount of detailed research, and this is based on facts, not guesswork.
Hi, Nicole Bivens Collinson with Sandler, Travis and Rosenberg, and a WIDA board member. I'm enjoying the passion with which this panel is presenting to us today, but I do have a question. One thing, just checking to make sure you all knew that today in the Federal Register notice, the U.S. has initiated the public process of setting comments to be submitted on the negotiating objectives for a UK agreement, as well as a hearing to be held in January. But with respect to that, knowing the interrelatedness of what you talked about earlier of your value chain and your supply chain with the European Union, and then looking towards a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, I think you saw in the USMCA negotiations that one of the objectives was to limit the outside influence of components, parts, or content. So given that, and knowing your relationship and reliance on the EU, how is it you imagine that the UK would be able to meet the strict rules of origin that the United States is sure to demand under any free trade agreement?
Yeah, I'll ask Shanga to take the main part of that. Just one thing. One of the things that was apparent to us is that process you described, the 90-day process and so on, essentially gets the United States to a position to be able to negotiate by the end of March, which is exactly what we want.
Thanks for the question. We did hear in our conversations with administration officials that indeed would be the case, and we would very much like to participate in that Federal Register notice. I think you make a good point with respect to the renegotiation of the USMCA and the rules of origin, particularly the auto sector, which will be problematic. That will be a negotiation. That will be a more difficult point now that USMCA has been negotiated than it would have been previously in a NAFTA sort of context. But it's important to note that just-in-time supply chains in the EU, in the EU 28, in the auto sector or other sectors, include components from outside the EU 28. 30 to 40% of many of those just-in-time supply chains involve components outside the EU 28 anyway. So the notion that we're limited by the local content rules in the auto sector, particularly for just-in-time supply chains in the EU 28, means that we can't do deals with others. It's not true. What we will need to do, however, and it will be tough because the administration has made it tougher in USMCA. But what we would seek to do in our negotiations is to accumulate rules of origin. If we are negotiating with the third countries that we have agreements with through the EU, which we are doing now, to replicate those arrangements, we would have to have the same rules of origin that the EU has with country X, in order that we could accumulate so that the EU 28 supply chain, the 27 plus UK components in the supply chain, could actually count as a UK-EU supply chain for the third country in that particular case. And as long as that third country wants to continue to have access to the UK market, there's no reason why they wouldn't agree with that. So, yeah, you're right. For that particular area of auto trade, we're going to have a challenge in negotiation with the US. But there are plenty of other areas where we will have challenges. There are plenty of other areas where we will want major liberalisation from the US. In areas like financial services, in areas like defence, the US is not exactly the most open market. There are many areas where the US will want us to change in terms of standards, in terms of product regulation on goods, in terms of SBS rules on agriculture. This will be a negotiation like any other negotiation. But the important thing is that we have concurrent negotiations with the US, with the EU, and with others, so we can do the read across that we would need to do to better position ourselves.
You hand the microphone behind.
No, there.
This will be our last question.
Thanks. Ralph Carter with FedEx. Really encouraged to hear Mr. Patterson's enthusiasm for the role of technology in enabling essentially a border-free trade zone between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So I assume you would support the same technologies between the UK and the EU, the broader trade market.
The short answer is yes. Owen will give you in much greater length. But one of the things that strikes me, I used to trade across the American-Canadian border. That border into Detroit, the Detroit crossing, it falls between one of your biggest car manufacturers, or some of your biggest car manufacturers, and a spectacularly large component provision industry in Canada. It's perfectly possible to run these systems across these borders. And in the case of your current borders, the technology you'll use there is 15 years old. And in the last 15 years, if we were all using the same mobile phones we had 15 years ago, we'd have big lumps in our pockets and suits out of shape because they're completely different technology. And it does seem to me that much of this can be done spectacularly well with modern technology, and Owen will talk to that.
Yes, totally endorse obviously your enthusiasm as well as a company, because it must be vital to have this as rapidly done as possible. The key thing is the intelligence, and all the borders we've looked at use intelligence. So the 2 to 3% that are pulled up in Rotterdam on the food products I was talking about, that all comes from an algorithm from Brussels, because they know there's been an outbreak of foot and mouth in that particular part of Argentina or Brazil. They know there's been avian flu near that duck farm in Thailand. Going back to the gentleman from the Irish Embassy, the inspections at Larne were very much intelligence-led. They know perfectly well that the shipments of sheep coming from, perhaps it's Mr. McGregor in Dumfries, are completely respectable, and he has very good veterinary records, and every sheep's going to have an ear tag. They know that perhaps Mr. McNally from Renfrew has a very different track record, so they'll look much more carefully at his truck. All this is all about pre-clearance and exchange of information, which is all tailor-made for modern technologies. And the vast majority of goods go through this. What's come out of this, actually, is the spectacular ignorance of politicians and civil servants as what borders are about. Borders are just tax points. They're nominal tax points. They're not inspection points. There's this crazy idea that there are people with large, stripy, red and white wooden poles stopping the stagecoach and coming out in a tricorn hat and sticking the ladle in the barrel of brandy and then dossing the coachman for 2 guineas. That just does not happen. Inspections do not happen at border points. They happen away from the borders. All the inspections are really happening at point of origin now, pre-clearance. And it's the exchange of data and exchange of information around the world that is really deciding what happens.
Let me, last question real quickly. Your remarks, your mention of China I find intriguing. Would you want, if the UK has an independent trade policy, given how much of it, I ask this given how much of it China is part of the US trade debate right now, the EU has not agreed with the US approach, although has been engaging in a trial discussion with the EU and Japan and the US that is clearly about China implicitly. To look like on this question, would it be closer to where the US is or closer to where the EU is?
Well, that'll be part of the negotiation. I suspect a little closer to the US is, but one of the arguments we've had ad nauseam in the European Union is exactly what our reaction should be to outside distortions, China being the most obvious one, but the EU itself is also a distorting factor too. Do you want to talk to this specifically?
I think you referenced the December 2017 EU-US-Japan statement on market distortions in third countries, which I think was an excellent piece of work. By the way, the Commission, DG Trade were upbraided for agreeing to that without a member state full collaboration. I think the important thing here is we have to have a policy with respect to China that enables us to differentiate between efficient China producers who are able to simply price at better prices in markets because of efficiency, versus not just state-owned enterprises, but also entities that are privileged by government distortions, artificial reductions in cost, all of those things. And I think that's the policy we've all been searching for, and it's not just a Trump administration phenomenon. This goes back, 20 years. It goes back to China's WTO accession, and it's critical that we find a mechanism to deal with that. Now, what we're suggesting is that we are both affected by these effects, just as you've had steel plants closing in various places in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan. We've had Port Talbot and Redcar, and we had similar issues at one point in Redcar. The unemployment rate amongst men under the age of 45 was about 100%. So there's serious dislocations going on. But we could agree, US and UK could agree, a absolute gold standard chapter on state-owned enterprises, gold standard chapter on distortions, because we don't have very many between us, that will then start to pave the way for a mechanism to deal with distortions. And it has to be real. It can't simply be, we want you to lower your distortions. It has to be some sort of trade remedy-like mechanism, but one that is based on the scale of the distortion and proof that there actually is a distortion, proof that it actually has an anti-competitive effect. And you want in your trade agreements offensively to limit those kinds of distortions, but you also want defensively to be able to limit them. But they have to be done in real time, so that the distorting country can prove that in fact there is no distortion, or prove that there is no anti-competitive effect, and then the tarification of the distortion will be reduced. But what we have so far tried to do with respect to China has not worked, and I think we have to recognise that. And it's not. And we use China as a proxy. Of course, it isn't just China. There's lots of countries that are engaged in these kinds of distortive practices, and as David suggested, increasingly within the EU, we're facing the same sorts of activities. So we have to find a mechanism to deal with this, and it starts with being able to measure them. It starts with being able to say this is the impact of these behind-the-border regulatory distortions. I'll say one thing on the scale of the problem, which is we've looked at this. I've looked at it both in my IEA hat and my other hat with the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and it's very clear that the gains from trade border barrier reductions are an order of magnitude lower than the gains from dealing with behind-the-border anti-competitive distortions. And these are the new barriers in international trade. We've got to be able to find a way of solving them.
So, agreed criteria, agreed evidence, agreed responses. That's the game we're playing.
Great. Well, on behalf of WIDA, let me thank all three of our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Davis, Mr. Patterson, Mr. Singham. Thank you for joining us. Honored to have had you here at WIDA today. It's interesting times in both of our countries, and we are pleased and privileged to have had the chance to host you today. Thank you.
And as one of your actors says, we'll be back.
Very good.